Are you a white supremacist, and have you been linked to, are you actually linked to any far-right groups?
People will call me a white supremacist, a far right, Nazi sympathizer or a Nazi, and all sorts of names. But obviously, I look very I wouldn't look like a typical white supremacist, and I don't think most of the far right or white supremacists in Australia would very much like to be in my company as a fellow member. So, those labels, and obviously currently different labels, are always thrown around to put people off from listening to your message. It's a part of the tactics of a lot of the people that try to discredit independent journalists.
Police were firing rubber bullets at protesters, and you were there in the thick of it, and you said something very profound. Well, it was actually disturbing. I was quite perturbed by this.
After rubber pellets, it goes to live ammunition. This is the escalation.
To see that escalation over time, when they're bringing out these heavy vehicles and so on, sure, there could be a scenario where police would fire live rounds. It happens in other parts of the world, and the police are no longer seen as, at least in the cities, as members of the community who are out there to protect you. Preface all of this with the fact that an Australian Julian Assange journalist has been deprived of his freedom. They will take this type of action against whistleblowers or against journalists to completely shut them down.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight we've got a very special guest. He's a journalist that became very well known over the last 3 years, someone that we've all come to love and admire. And during the dark days of medical tyranny, there was a media blackout on what was actually transpiring in Australia. And the world wasn't aware of what was going on in the land of Oz until our guest tonight shone a bright light on what was happening at the protests in Melbourne. So Rukshan, Fernando, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for the intro, Leon. I don't want to take all the credit for doing that. There was a few independent journalists and people out there in the community doing this type of work. I just happened to be in the midst of it in Melbourne, where a lot of the craziest stuff was happening during that time.
That was a hotbed of everything that was happening, not just in Australia, but the world, of medical tyranny. So we've got to be careful of how we speak, because I almost got banned on YouTube after I did my last interview. So
they're still doing that, are they? They're still banning
They're
people.
still doing it, yes. So I did my last podcast with Nick Patterson. Rukshan, we'll talk about, there was one particular clip that went viral all around the world, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I've got a really pressing question to ask you. I need to get this off my chest. Are you a white supremacist, and have you been linked to, are you actually linked to any far-right groups?
I'm actually a Zionist now, according to my detractors. So they can put any type of label on me that they like. These labels, obviously, during that coverage of those things during the COVID time, people were calling me a white supremacist, a far right, Nazi sympathizer or a Nazi, and all sorts of names. But obviously, I look very I wouldn't look like a typical white supremacist, and I don't think most of the far right or white supremacists in Australia would very much like to be in my company as a fellow member. So no, definitely not. But those labels, and obviously currently different labels, are always thrown around to put people off from listening to your message. It's a part of the tactics of a lot of the people that try to discredit independent journalists, and it happens on all sides. And for someone who's a conservative, that's kind of the political ideology that I prescribe to. It's very easy for people to say, look, he's influenced by either white supremacy or Zionism, whatever it is that they want to label you as for certain particular views.
It's interesting that you call yourself a conservative, because the Age newspaper, this is from 2021, sorry, it's a little bit old. It's affectionately known as the Spencer Street Soviet. For good reason, of course. Now, that they did a piece on you, I would describe it as a bit of a hit piece. And the interesting part of that is they claim that you come from a Labor family. So can you give our audience a snapshot of your background up until 2020? And especially with that, report around you, or that claim that you come from a Labor family.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Labour family because of any kind of political connections my family's had or anything like this. But, most migrants that, immigrate to Australia, come to Australia, whether through, legal migration or legal migration or as a refugee, whatever it is, they have an affinity towards, I guess, more of the left-leaning politics or the Labour side of politics, particularly people that came here in the 80s and 90s. My parents, they like Bob Hawke, they like Paul Keating. They think that these are the people that allowed them to come to Australia, and they've always kind of had that close connection to the Labour side of politics because, Labour has traditionally represented the views of migrants. At least that's the way that they portray it. So, that's kind of the family environment that I grew up in, where my parents would always vote Labour, not because they actually knew what the policies were, or not because they followed politics closely, but because they've always had that, loyalty to the party that was in power when they, came to Australia. So that's kind of where that comes from, and it's taken a long time for my parents, my family, to understand that they're a part of this country, and to take part in this country, particularly the political discourse. It does mean that you can have different political parties that you can support at different times of your life in this country. So that's the progression that I'm talking about. So obviously for myself, growing up in Australia, going to school here with through primary to tertiary, and then through high school, university, all that kind of stuff, doing all of that in Australia. I'm my own person, and I've grown up here, so I've been able to pick my politics and decide where I fit in. So that is the change in myself. So it's not particularly going from a Labour family to becoming something that's a bit more conservative or a liberal or whatever it is. It's more so finding that myself through living and growing up in Australia, with the understanding that politics is not something that you're born into. It's something that you can decide later on in life what you're more inclined to, your values, and who you are, what that aligns with.
And I think we're the same age. We both grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think this is my perspective, of course. I think the left during that time, so this was around the time that the Soviet Union fell, and then from that time onwards throughout the 90s, I think the left moderated. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, they became more centre-left, especially the mainstream parties. And I remember in the UK, they had Tony Blair who announced that there was going to be a new Labour Party. They called it New Labour. So it's supposed to be centre-left. And I think at some point they became more radicalized, probably around the time of the Bush's misadventure in Iraq in the early 2000s. What's your perspective of that? Has the left become more radicalized and less, has drifted further and further away from the center?
Yeah, look, it wasn't until my late teens that I really started kind of focusing on political things. So growing up in the 90s and stuff, I wasn't really too aware of the political impact of, left or right and all this kind of stuff. But definitely now looking back through my high school years through university to today, there is a massive shift in terms of the power of the political left and the use of ideology, the use of indoctrination in many ways. I don't remember that type of indoctrination when I was at school, like learning about Australia or singing the anthem, doing all these kind of very basic things that we took for granted back then, perhaps. Today, we're learning all of that is, all of that is evil, to put it in the terms of what the left describe it as. So it's not something that I was paying attention to, but definitely looking back now, there has been a shift in terms of how pervasive their influence is on society, particularly the younger generation. A lot of us, I think those of us who grew up in the 90s maybe are not so impacted by this, because we can remember a life before all this kind of ideological wokeism that's so prevalent today, right? We can remember that world. But people and kids that grew up in that world are maybe finding it hard to understand that there was a life before all this woke stuff.
That's all they know.
That's all they know, and they're more susceptible to being influenced by it. I think I'm seeing that happening a lot more. And a story that I tell a lot of people is that, there are kids who are born to people my age, so people who are a part of that generation, that came from migrant families who had a hard time in this country in terms of settling in, and in the 90s, and that life was a bit tougher maybe in many ways back then. But today, with all the advancements in technology, communications, all these kind of advancements that we have, they believe they're suffering more than their parents' generation, and it's ridiculous. So there is definitely something going on in terms of ideological influence on younger generations, which is it's becoming a part of it is a part of popular culture, of course, but it's part of so many other aspects of our life, whether it's sports. You literally can't do anything these days without it being involved in some type of political. It says something about what you believe in if you support this team or that team. It's become that way, and it's a part of our lives whether we like it or not.
That's right. I guess it's by design. There's this push, and it's been happening over the last couple of decades, where victimhood has become a virtue, and it's being promoted and put on a pedestal. People are encouraged to be victims, and like you said, Generation Z, the millennials, they're all conditioned to think that way and to glorify that. And also, the left has drifted so far from the center. You mentioned people from immigrant backgrounds. I mean, the families immigrant families tend to be more conservative. So in your case, I'm assuming your family were obviously Catholic, so they were conservative Catholics. During the Hawke and the Keating era, it was possible to vote for Labor because they didn't have these crazy views. Gender's fluid and all these other ideas that are just completely whacked. They were more to the center, and today they would be described as being conservative. The policies, especially the social policies, that they had. But let's rewind. Let's go back a little and rewind back to 2020. So that's the year. It's obviously the turning point for millions of people, millions of Australians, and people all around the world, but particularly for you in your career as a citizen journalist. At what point in 2020 did you start to question what was happening with the whole schmovid agenda? I'm trying to avoid the algorithm, the censors, so trying my best to watch my language. But at what stage did you start to question it?
Yeah, sure. Look, what led me to question a lot of what was happening was just seeing these press conferences that we were privy to every day in Victoria. Of course, the politicians took full advantage of getting in front of the cameras and telling us every single day what they were doing. That's how they portrayed it, right? But what they weren't doing was taking accountability for a lot of the obvious mistakes that were being made by them. So for me, as someone who is a business owner and had a business that was put on hold, of course, the things which are happening where businesses are restricted, where your life is put on hold, makes you want to know, okay, so I've put everything on hold now. We've been told to sacrifice everything in our lives, and this is across the board in most industries. What is now the government doing? So you start to pay attention because politics now is in your life. You can't avoid it. You can't go through life without thinking about what these politicians are doing. So, for me, that I became razor focused on every single detail of these press conferences and what they were saying. And particularly around issues like the hotel quarantine fiasco that we had in Victoria. A lot of the fiascos that were created by the Andrews Labor government here in Victoria made me, like a meerkat, almost look up and be like, what about, how long have these people been behaving this way? How long have they been doing this? So once you start questioning, the issues around transparency and accountability, and the fact that they're asking so much of us, but they're giving us very little information, and they're taking very little accountability for the decisions that they're making. It's a hard time. Like I'm a realist. I understand that during that time, we talk about it being unprecedented and all these new things are happening. And of course, even for those in the political class, the politicians, it would be a hard time making decisions. and I'm willing to give them a break on those things. But doing it once or twice, 3 times, maybe that's okay. But doing it, multiple times after that, and then just blaming the public for it, and then putting more and more impositions on public and businesses and more restrictions, more lockdowns. Of course, any sane, reasonable person would want to, from that point onwards, hey, look, what are these people up to? How can we trust these people? Those are legitimate questions that arise from, looking at these people just every day screwing things up. I think it's a very normal reaction that I had. And I think it's not just myself. Many Victorians had this reaction. Many Australians had this reaction. And many people around the world had this reaction because many governments were, fully exposed for their incompetency when the public was watching them doing what they're meant to be doing as leaders. We could see their flaws every single day in our faces, impacting our lives.
But it's interesting that you mentioned before that we're in the age of technology. Everyone's being watched, everything's being filmed, monitored. But during that time, it seems like maybe there were a few exceptions, but most of the prostitute media just went along with the agenda. No matter they didn't even question, there were glaring contradictions. And they weren't even, not only were they not questioning it, but they were parroting all of the talking points, the official talking points of the government. So at what point did you decide, to take, I guess, seeing that the journalists didn't do their job, did you decide to, take the initiative and go on the street and start interviewing people? What was the turning point for that?
Look, turning point for that probably goes back to, for me, really focusing on media and how they manipulate news. Probably goes back to 2016. I focused a lot on the campaign by Donald Trump in the US during that election campaign, and then I've learned really upfront what fake news is, especially with a lot of the media hysteria. There was just some stories where it's just like, seriously, like, this is just a beat up. They're just like literally making stuff up. There's a lot of speculation. It seems like it's true. Like if you didn't pay attention to it, it seemed like a plausible story. So from that point onwards, I really started focusing on the manipulation by mainstream media and this whole idea around fake news. And then seeing that throughout 2020 during this pandemic time, it was really mixed, because right at the start of this, I was paying attention to it towards the end of December 2019, Jan 2020, very early on. And they were downplaying a lot of the stuff that was happening overseas. So it was mixed, the media. Like you said, at one point they switched to just parroting what the government was saying. But very early on, they were downplaying, for instance, the effectiveness of masks. We have these clips and videos of Brett Sutton and these other people talking about how masks are ineffective and so forth. So it kind of changed throughout. So the media, the government, they kind of switch it up depending on what narrative that they want to go with. And during that time, I saw that the narrative that was being portrayed wasn't necessarily in the best interests of everyday people, wasn't necessarily in the best interests of Victorians in particular in my state. So that's why I went out with my camera to film some of the discontent that we're seeing on the streets, because that was really something that concerned me, that the portrayal of people who were protesting, in particular these things, wasn't necessarily accurate.
Terrific. Sorry, I'm just having some technical issues there.
They've taken me
out. They've taken me out. Just a moment.
Take.
So I just wanted to ask you, while I'm fixing my camera, Anastasia Palaszczuk recently resigned.
Yes.
Now, there seems to be a pattern with all of these leaders in Australia. So Dan Andrews, Mark McGowan, and also in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. So the pattern is this: they would go on to try to contest their third term. They would win a re-election by a landslide, and then 6 to 8 months or under 12 months, they would resign. The latest being, of course, Palaszczuk in Queensland. Rukshan, what on earth is going on here?
Yeah, look, it's a hard one to kind of decipher. It seems like they're running away, but then again, you saw someone like Andrews who actually went to an election and won the election. So it's mixed. I think a lot of them are burnt out. Honestly, I believe they're burnt out in the sense that they're not viable anymore as politicians because they've just spread so much crap. They've made so many mistakes during that time, particularly during the pandemic time, but also later on with the recovery around that and how they address people after that as well. Even especially someone like Jacinda Ardern, she was very unpopular, and you can see the results of the most recent election, even though she wasn't involved in that. The major shift that's happened in New Zealand, that's how unpopular people like Jacinda Ardern has been. So we're seeing that in Queensland. I believe Anastasia is really unpopular, and it's not looking good for Labor come the next election. Western Australia with Mark McGowan again, it's hard to say with this guy. Daniel Andrews, really, like I said, it threw me off a little bit because he did convincingly win that election. I think that goes more so to his unpopularity with a lot of the debt this state is in. We have a lot of issues with a lot of this debt caused by his infrastructure projects and the tunnels and all this kind of stuff that he finds free money for, which is not free money. It's just accumulated, massive amounts of debt for the future generations of Victorians. I think a lot of that may be weighing on his decision to exit and leave it as something to clean up for the party. Yeah, it's a hard one. Look, I'd like to think they're running away scared and they're trying to get away from accountability and transparency. But honestly, like these guys are career politicians and they're taking the exit to suit their party, so their party members can potentially win in the next coming election. It's selfish in many ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean they won convincing majorities, after the COVID pandemic and even during. I mean, I know Jacinta Ardern obviously resigned before the election, but after COVID or during COVID, she won a really big majority, and so did Daniel Andrews. But let me ask you, just going back a little to the time, so where you've had a lot of footage that went viral all around the world, and you've really, made a name for yourself as a respected journalist. But there was one footage in particular going back to 2021 that made headlines all around the world, and this was at the height of the media blackout. And this was when police were firing rubber bullets at protesters. And you were there in the thick of it, and you said something very profound. Well, it was actually disturbing. I was quite perturbed by this. You said that, now that they're shooting rubber bullets, next they'll be shooting live bullets. Do you really think that Victoria Police is capable of doing that?
Well, I come from a worldview in Australia, growing up in Australia. I didn't think it was capable for Victoria Police to just be shooting rubber bullets at ordinary people protesting on the street. I'm talking about peaceful protests here, where there's no threat to Victoria Police per se, or So I didn't think that was possible. So to see that escalation over time, when they're bringing out these heavy vehicles and so on, sure, there could be a scenario where police would fire live rounds. It happens in other parts of the world. It happens in back home in where my parents come from in Sri Lanka. Police are known to shoot people, protesters, right? So these things escalate. These things happen, and we're not the same type of society. Of course, we're not exactly the same, but there's nothing stopping humans from behaving in this manner besides the foundational values of the country. And I believe during that time, during the pandemic time, a lot of the foundational values of Australia, a lot of the things that we believed about our country and how our authorities and how our police would treat us, a lot of that was broken, and it was done very openly. And the police were very okay, and I still believe they still haven't apologized for a lot of things that they did. They were completely fine with shooting rubber bullets into people. I believe they still think that was justified. And what was it all for? What was it for? Right? It was just purely about intimidation. It was purely about scaring other people from coming onto the street. It was purely about maintaining control. So, look, I don't believe that in the West, police are actively going out to figure out ways to shoot protesters with live rounds. No, but the escalation, those signs are there that, if society gets to such a point where there is some sort of tension that could end up leading to another civil unrest of some sort, that these kind of options would be on the table. It's not far-fetched to believe that would be possible. Again, I don't think that they're capable of it, during right now, just because they want to. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if the conditions, like the pandemic conditions or any type of civil unrest where there was an element of losing control or they had some justification for doing this, sure, they can justify almost anything that they do. And they justified all sorts of nonsense that today we look at it and we can maybe even laugh about some of the things that they justified, because with hindsight, with time, even though some people during that time maybe saw a lot of that as ridiculous, now almost the whole population sees a lot of that stuff as ridiculous, as nonsense. And,
Well, the whole world was laughing at Australia.
well, yeah, I mean, the world looked at us and thought, well, this is this a Western country? Australia and Canada, these countries where they were behaving like this with their own people. So, and there would have been countries where people were shot at during protests and stuff, and that's probably why they didn't protest in some of those places where they locked them down. But here, we don't believe that our police would be doing anything of that sort. And it doesn't also not to discount the fact that these rubber projectiles or whatever they're using, they can also be lethal. They're also dangerous.
That's correct.
Especially being fired indiscriminately to crowds of people, families, and all this kind of stuff is complete nonsense in Australia. And we should have condemn it regardless of whether they're live rounds or projectiles, because it shouldn't have been happening in the first place in that instance.
Yeah, what amazes me, I mean, first of all, the police have become politicized, or they became politicized under Daniel Andrews. They were acting like his personal security and going after his political dissidents.
There are protesting, like the police are protesting in Victoria. They're writing stuff on their cars and stuff about their wages, and they're saying, what do you want to choose between having police protection, or because we're underpaid, we might not be able to show up, all this kind of stuff. Like they're saying that they can take a stand against the government, but during that time, they didn't take an ethical or moral stand against some of the decisions that they were told to do. They were happy to do it, right? They had no issues with it. Now today they're out there protesting about their wages, saying, "Oh, we want extra whatever percentage it is, or we might not cooperate with the government. We'll tell you where the speed cameras are. We'll do this, we'll do that." It's it really shows them up for what they are during that time. And this is the police unions. I don't know if it's I can blame individual members. There would be people who maybe are hypocrites, but at least the police unions in this instance are happy to not cooperate with the government and make a stand. And these organizations are unable to make ethical or moral stands when it really mattered in our country, when it really mattered in Victoria. They were found wanting, and I think that's gonna hang over them for forever, as much as they might want to deny it. People like Shane Patton and all these guys that were a part of the leadership team, they will always, deep down, they will know what they did was wrong, because I think any moral or ethical person will know that what happened during that time to just ordinary Victorians was completely wrong.
And there were some exceptions. You had Crystal Mitchell, who had a very prominent, I believe she had a high-ranking job in the police, and she took a very principled stand. So there were some exceptions.
When I talk about the police or these organizations, I talk more so about the leadership. I don't want to disparage individual people. There's different conditions why people end up doing the jobs that they do. Some people will take a stand. Some people, maybe because of financial reasons, they don't. Like I understand all of that. But as a police force, I think it's fair to criticize them because at the moment they've taken a very active stance in protesting and showing some civil for their own pay. Imagine the respect that our police would have, and people would be out there demanding that they get paid more and ensuring that we have highly paid, highly effective police force. If the police had the respect of the public. But they don't. The firefighters have the respect of the public in many ways. We have our the paramedics who largely have the respect of the public. the police force, they might be trying to scratch their heads and figure out why, but for some reason they don't have the respect of the public. They definitely don't have the respect of the far left, who they always succumb to, who go around screaming ACAB all the time, right? And then the conservatives or the right or the center, who traditionally espouse the ideals of good policing and say that back the blue or whatever. They were hating on them as well during that time. So they really have no friends out in the political landscape. And I think that's why they're finding some of these conversations difficult, because, police aren't liked by anyone in Victoria, let alone, I don't know about the rest of Australia, but in Victoria, it doesn't matter.
Effectively shot themselves in the foot.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who I speak to, left, right, center, whatever, they have an issue with the policing and the police.
Do you think that's by design? Because there is a theory promoted by certain individuals or groups that say that there is a move to create a society that's essentially lawless, or at least, there's a move to undermine governments as well as police, and it's happening on a global level. What's your take on that?
Well, look, at least in Victoria, there's a lot of issues between the public and the police across all types of issues. Like we're just discussing, just the general distrust of the police. But, policing in itself is problematic in Victoria. We have police who are just in their policies, it appears that they don't want to deal with, crimes out in the community, particular crimes, but they're happy to enforce, speeding tickets and things like this. So that two-tier policing itself in that manner has created all sorts of discontent in society. And the police are no longer seen as, at least in the cities, as members of the community who are out there to protect you. They're seen as people that want to either fine you, they're revenue raising off you, they're working for the government. That whole aspect of this police force that's protecting the community has disappeared. And they can make commercials all they like, and they can, hold barbecues and, do the Mardi Gras and all these kind of things. But the actual policies and the actions in terms of effectively managing things with which the community expects of them to manage, essentially, which is, if your house gets robbed, you want help from the police. Those things don't exist anymore, right? We have police which encourage you to don't even ring the emergency line. Ring this number, and you ring them, and they tell you, okay, a couple of days, we'll sort this out. Like, it's just useless. Like, you can do a lot of things more by yourself if you want to chase up something that's happened to you. You're probably more effective, the community around you helping you, which is traditionally what policing comes from historically. It's just all inverted now. So yes, maybe there is a bit of truth to these kind of claims or things that people are saying about how a lot of this is about creating discontent within society as a whole, where there is a lawlessness. Who is policing us anymore? People get away with all types of crimes these days, major crimes. And
in the years leading up to COVID, it's interesting, there were home invasions, a big spike in home invasions. I think it's the last 5 years leading up to 2020. And the police during that time were very ineffective. And there was also an incident in the city where you had I think it was the Burke Street massacre. So the police were just standing around watching this crazy guy go on a rampage, and they were just useless, doing nothing. And then you contrast that to how they behaved during 2020, 2021 and 2022. But during that period leading up to 2020, the claim was that they were under-resourced. But then we saw that perhaps that wasn't the case. Let me ask...
No, go for it.
Let me ask you, you've received visits from police at odd hours of the night. So you're clearly a person who's experienced police intimidation, because you're quite active in the freedom movement. Over the last 8 weeks, 8 weeks in a row, and it's still ongoing, we've had thousands of people in the city protesting about a totally different issue, about an issue happening overseas, over in Gaza. Let me ask you, do you see a difference between how the police behaved during the 2020 to 2021 era with how they treated protesters to now? Is there a contrast?
There is a contrast, but there's also a difference in situations. You know, I'm aware of this as well. So obviously they had different type of powers during that time, and they were happy to use those powers. But I think in general, there is a difference in policing in the sense that they pretend they can't do things. And we don't have to talk about the COVID era to see this. I think just last week we had the police taking action against climate protesters, and they were enforcing certain, rules around the protests, and they made an arrest and all this kind of stuff. But of course, then we have them unable to act against some of these actions that we're seeing against the Jewish community at the moment. At some of these protests, and as an observer, you see the policing is different, and a lot of it goes down to, I believe, this is my own personal view. I have no way to prove this kind of stuff, but they're afraid of getting involved in cultural issues. It's easy for the police to arrest Australians, white Australians, or people with Australian values, or people who are talking about Australian issues. They have no problem with kicking down someone's door because you said something bad about climate change, for instance, or something like this, right? But as soon as you get into areas around cultural sensitivities, as soon as you get into areas around that could cause a bigger issue for them if they take a particular stance, they will try to backtrack and avoid confrontation. They will not use those powers, not use those laws. So we have actions against, but I must preface that with the fact that they've also struggled to deal with those far right groups that are parading around Bendigo or Ballarat. So they gave them
an escort.
They gave them an escort. So it's all very confusing when you look at the way that the police behave. But law-abiding citizens, like everyday people who protest an issue, it's easy for them to shoot them with rubber bullets. It's easy for them to go knocking on their doors and tell them to stay at home.
And arrest put a pregnant woman in handcuffs.
Because these are law-abiding, decent Victorians and Australians who don't actually have an axe to grind with the police. They have legitimate concerns and issues that they want raised that causes other issues for the current sitting government of the day. See, the protest that we're seeing out on the streets today, yes, it doesn't directly impact the government in the same manner as the discontent that we saw during COVID, when people are out on the streets and they're jobless, their lives are being turned upside down by the government. The government needs to quell that. They need to crush that because they don't want more people coming out to stop that. But a lot of the protests today, potentially for the government, this is again my opinion, they might view that as somewhat of a distraction for the population, and that most people are just observing. They're not really going to care about the police action either way. Of course, people who are intimately aware of the situation and are impacted by these protests will be concerned about them, and they'll be concerned about the lack of police action or the fact that the police are taking action. But the general population won't really react to it. But any situation where the general population might overwhelmingly react negatively towards the government, you see the police stepping in. And that goes back to this fact that potentially, yes, they are acting as a state, as an arm of the government, as a protection force for the government and enforcing government control over the population. Again, there's no way to prove any of these things, but it goes to some of the actions that we've been seeing over the last couple of years and the discrepancies and, the two-tier, the different standards of policing, because none of it really makes sense, right? It's very confusing observing the way that they decide which issue is important for them to prosecute and which issue is not.
And this is a nice little segue into my next question. I'll just start off just giving a little bit of a perspective, just going on the back of what you said. So I noticed that whenever people protest directly against anything linked to the WEF agenda, the police become very aggressive, unusually aggressive and violent. And I remember, this is going back a while back, 2 decades ago, 1999 and early 2000s, when the WEF came to Australia and they had a conference in, I think it was Crown Casino. Klaus Schwab was actually apparently there, according to old news footage. And I remember this as a high school student watching the footage, and you can still watch the footage on YouTube. It's still up there. The police were absolutely aggressive and violent, and this is not normal policing. They were, beating people up, kind of like what we saw during 2020, 2021, ultra aggressive, militarized. But the only unique thing was back then, the left was was leading the protest marches against the WEF. And then during 2020 to 2021, the left was pretty much part of they supported the whole agenda. But you did something unique right after the medical tyranny, the restrictions were lifted. You went to Davos with Avi. So I'd be curious to get your perspective on that. And I'll just start by asking you, seeing how environmentally conscious the WEF delegates are and how concerned they are about the environment. I wasn't there, but I'm just making an assumption. Would it be fair to say that they traveled there by commercial airline to the main airport and then took public transport to the WEF forum in Davos? Would that be a fair assumption?
I mean, they could. Switzerland has excellent public transport, as far as I could tell. I don't understand why they don't, because they have very good facilities in terms of getting to these places. But no, they didn't. They came in all manner of, is it carbon emitting? I don't know, fossil fuel emitting, whatever. These private jets, all this kind of stuff, and they build a fake city in Davos at that time, so more waste. But of course, they put placards saying all of this is 100% recyclable and all this kind of nonsense as well. Look, it's all a great theatrical show. I don't even understand who the show is for, because it's all people who they're all there. They're all in that mind frame anyway. They're all just patting each other on the back. Yeah, so it was kind of weird in a way to see that and to be there. It's like to see that part of the world and how these things operate. Obviously, we didn't have the credentials to get past the barricades that they put up with the security and so on. So it's very telling, right, that these people have to barricade themselves in some mountain in Switzerland, and that's the only way that they can meet up and discuss these things. But yeah, it is what it is. I'm glad that I got to go there firsthand that first year after that and see what it was all about. And I've walked away from that knowing that these organizations, they're always going to exist. They're always going to exist, no matter what we think of them and what we might say about them. They will always exist in some manner, and a lot of it is consented to by governments. I believe governments need these type of organizations to exist, to whichever underhanded way that they decide when they bring all these people together, to create these plans or visions for the future and do this networking. It's just a way for them to do for them to do it off the books, maybe. Whereas normally in democracies we expect our governments, to serve our interests in public. This allows them to meet up with all these people who have all types of different interests for all types of varying reasons, sometimes nefarious. And the problem with these WEF and these organizations is they paint everything in such a rosy way, like everything is for your benefit, everything is for the good, and that's not the reality of the world we live in. Our governments, ourselves, in our countries, make all types of disastrous decisions that don't benefit us. So this whole mirage that they create around their organization, I think that's what's off-putting for people. And I think a lot of people, now that they've started focusing in on these organizations, they can smell the BS. They can smell. They know this is not this is not real, the way that they're portraying it. Perhaps I think the WEF started in the 70s or 80s, a long
That's
time
right.
ago. So during that time, there wasn't this interconnected world where we could see all this stuff and be aware of what's happening in different countries and understand how these policies impact different countries and talk to people who are impacted by these policies. But today we see it all, and we see this BS for what it is. And I think these organizations will always exist, but I think they will maybe try to be more low key, try to be more discreet. They might not be so open about some of their things. You're seeing that already with the WEF, their social media. they can't put something up on Twitter where they enable the comments, for instance.
That's right.
They're very careful with how they post stuff now. They're very, because people have caught on to it. They can't put up anything on any subject without getting called out for it anymore. Like, they've lost that legitimacy. And politicians who align themselves with these organizations, they also get tarred with that same brush. So there's people that I believe there are people or business people who are now a part of these organizations who will say, don't put us on your website with that little WEF logo, the one that all these.
They'll make him the kiss of death. They'll make him unelectable.
It's like the kiss of death. So they'll still have these things, but I think they'll go a bit more underground because the public is catching on now, right? And they're understanding that these organizations, even though they pretend to do good for the world, it's not necessarily always in our best interests. And we need to understand more in terms of, not that businesses can get together and have conferences. Who cares? They need to do that. That's fine. But what is the involvement of governments that go there? What is the involvement of elected politicians that are a part of these groups? How does that influence them? I think these are legitimate questions to be asking, particularly in Western democracies, where we elect these people to represent our interest in Australia first. And I think that's what most people get peeved off about, because it feels like we are serving global interests most of the time, and not just our own interests. So what works for Australia, what ensures that Australian families can put food on the table, can afford to buy groceries. What ensures that? Does all of this globalized stuff actually help us? These are the questions that many ordinary people would be asking.
That's correct.
That's why these organizations are losing the favor of the ordinary people who have caught on to them.
It looks like, though, our government, unfortunately, both the state and the federal, especially the federal government, is still very out of touch, and they're still talking about, carbon emissions and renewables when people are having trouble putting bread on the table and paying their bills. And this is just, all of this is exacerbating, there's the situation, the crisis. And it seems like Elbow and Blackout Bowen and Penny Wong, they all live in this Davos bubble. They're up this little tree, up an ivory tower that they don't want to come down from. And it's interesting, though, you mentioned that they're all barricaded, but that you do have the opportunity to approach them on the street in what appears to be the main square of Davos. Yes. All these big delegates.
Yes.
And
so I think that was really, I think that's something like Avi did, Rebel News did. So I was there with Avi as a collaboration doing this, right? But they kind of come out of that barricade, obviously, because it's, maybe they want to get away from it, and they come into the little sanctuary of Davos itself, and maybe they weren't prepared for people to be there this time, because we're all paying attention now, right? So there to in a way journalistically snipe them, catch them off guard. And it leads to very interesting interactions. You saw, I think I wasn't there last year, but Avi caught up with Albert Bourla, the
That's
CEO,
right.
the CEO of Pfizer. Now, Albert Bourla does a lot of media. He's not someone that hides away from the media, but he does a lot of controlled media.
Friendly media, that's right.
Friendly media. So this is the difference, right? So these people are never asked questions without...
They get softball questions.
Yeah, without being prepared for it. So to actually see someone like that sweating, avoiding very basic, simple questions that a lot of people want to ask, it doesn't matter that he didn't answer them. The fact that he was running away from these questions, I think that shows a lot. And I think that video went viral in India, for instance. The Indians loved what Avi did that day with Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, because they're very unhappy with Pfizer, and they didn't want to have anything to do with Pfizer for all types of different reasons, and possibly that for many good reasons. So we don't get those interactions from traditional media anymore, in Western media, and this is a safe zone, because in Davos, a lot of the stands, a lot of the like little setups that they do are run by media organizations. So it's a protected, safe space. So to be a part of the delegation, and to be a part of the delegates or the media that's in there, you are getting questions which are from people who are in a way friendly. Even if the questions seem unfriendly, they don't want to break those relationships, so they'd never be invited there again. No one's going to go out there and ask, Albert Bourla about his the effectiveness of one of his products in the manner that Avi would, for instance, as someone who's not beholden to that kind of institutional capture that you're seeing in Davos. So that was quite interesting for me to see. And that Albert Bourla is just one example. When I was there was all types of different people who were walking.
You ran into Nas Daily.
Yeah, well, Nas Daily. He's a content creator, but he's a different type of content creator. He's in that world, so that's why he was brought in to kind of jazz up the World Economic Forum to make it more palatable for the younger generations, perhaps. I don't know if that's working out too well, but yeah, that's kind of they're acutely aware of the fact that these new era of influences are important for them to capture the younger generation when it comes to some of these ideas.
Yeah, I would argue that someone like Nas and all these other so-called influencers on YouTube and other platforms, TikTok, are really very much a part of the media establishment, but they're obviously catering to a younger demographic, like you said.
Of course, yes.
I want to also just find out about your recent trips. So you went to New Zealand, you went to London. With New Zealand, this was going back about 6 months ago. I know that Avi was banned. I think you were almost banned from.
This was a while back. Yeah, so Avi was banned. I was questioned at the airport during at the Qantas counter. They couldn't when they scanned my passport because it was flagged by immigration in New Zealand, so they had to contact them. Avi was just completely flagged, obviously, and he couldn't get there. That's the whole story. But yeah, there were these type of issues, and it's again, when you think about it and the context and the situation around it, it's just ridiculous. We were literally just going across to New Zealand to cover a protest. I mean, this is not. We're talking about countries like Australia right now, where we've released people into the community who have all types of criminal histories. You understand what I'm saying? There's people who are involved in sexual assaults, all this kind of stuff, who have been released into our community. And I'm sure that kind of stuff happens in New Zealand as well. But here they are worried about some journalists coming to cover a protest, an anti-government protest. Like that is like something where they get everyone involved to stop that from happening. It's just, we've really lost our way when I recount my time during that time in New Zealand. And I went to the protest. I got into New Zealand. I covered the protest. It was just a very kind of average protest in the sense of it wasn't like a major protest. There was no issues. Nothing happened. People just said, "Oh, the government's not, looking after us, and we're going to vote them out." That was literally it. So why all this crazy activity and blocking passports and all this kind of nonsense for a protest? It's just crazy, to think that Interpol was involved and they were searching my name up and they were sending information to Australia. It's just, yeah, it's ridiculous when I think about it. It was laughable, but it's just the kind of the world that we're in today. Because as soon as you, again, have journalists or independent thinkers or people who they say are, activists sometimes talking about anti-government issues, they're happy to use all the resources they have, any manner of tactic to stall them or to stop them from covering whatever that may be.
Well, Ardern said, "We are your only source of truth, the government. Don't trust any other information." And this leads on to my next question. So you actually got a little bit of criticism when I was advertising our interview on Cafe Lockdown. One person piped up and claimed that you weren't reporting on the recent whistleblower incident in New Zealand. But I just want to fact check that person. I did see that you did tweet about it. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that latest development.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot going on with that stuff, and there's also a lot going on in my life at times. So, as an independent journalist, it's hard to kind of be across everything and do everything else as well. So many people think that I can, if I don't cover this particular topic, for some reason I don't support it, or for some reason that I'm pro this or pro that. It doesn't necessarily work like that. More so,
but you did actually. I mean, to be fair to you, you did actually tweet about it.
Yes,
so,
yeah, definitely. I don't normally talk about things where I haven't had time to really research it or give people the proper information. I don't normally do that unless I make that time or unless I'm covering a protest or interviewing someone about it. Look, it's. I think again, I don't know too much about it to speak as an authority on the whole issue, but it is again concerning that we have governments taking this type of action to stop this information coming out. They were happy, in to very publicly share people's vaccination information. For instance, we were all forced to do it. If you wanted to access this or access that, the whole public was told that you had to do that. Like there was no privacy, right? That's kind of the world that the government created. To now turning around and saying, "Oh well, now this is sensitive data, it's private information, this and that."
Shifting of the goalposts.
Yeah, they shift the goalposts. That, and then also you have issues around journalists' access to this type of whistleblower data, whistleblower protection issues. Does the government get to decide who's a whistleblower because they don't like the kind of content that they've put out there? So it creates more chaos and more issues than there should be. I think if there was nothing to hide, a lot of this data could probably be randomized in such a way that it doesn't actually have people's identifying information, and the government could cooperate with other scientific bodies or organizations to have a look at some of this data. Or the same way that people are doing now anyway, but it's technically illegal to even host it, I think, on some services around the world. So yeah, it's not something that I know too much about in terms of, because I haven't really talked to anyone about it or that's intimately involved with it. But just the general aspects of it, there are concerning elements to it, of course.
Absolutely. And look, my family comes from the former Soviet Union, and we experienced a lot of tyranny and police state censorship, but never in my lifetime would I expect to see something like this happening in Australia and New Zealand, these beautiful laid back countries, both termed the lucky countries. I mean, who would have thought?
Yeah. I just want to preface all of this with the fact that we have Julian Assange, who is hello?
Yep, I'm still there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I cut out for a second. Give me a second. Sorry, man.
That's all right. We'll have to edit this part out.
Yeah, I wanted to preface all of this with the fact that an Australian Julian Assange journalist has been deprived of his freedom for so many years, and he's been hiding out in embassies and all sorts of things for exposing some information related to what authorities, governments in Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes, the US, in what they've been involved in. And this is legitimate stuff that the public should know. So this has been happening for a long time. It's not just during this COVID time. I think governments, whenever they're pushed and tested by journalists in this manner, they will take this type of action against whistleblowers or against journalists to completely shut them down. And it's we think of countries like Saudi Arabia or something doing this to one of their journalists. I think they famously killed one inside an embassy or something.
In Turkey, that's right.
In Turkey, yeah.
They invited him back for a friendly chat in the embassy in Turkey, and never went out, came out again.
Right. So we think these countries are capable of this type of action, but actually, our countries in Australia and New Zealand, we do similar things. We might not kill them, but we'll deprive them of their freedom, and we'll keep them detained for a long time. So a lot of this, I think, goes into dissuading other people from doing this. Maybe other whistleblowers with some of this data, and it might be nothing at all, but I think they want to just keep a lid on something potentially meaningful coming out from people doing this by setting an example of someone.
I think, to be fair to the Labor government, I'm a very big critic of them. I think they're, compared to the last Morrison government, they're probably, everything's relative, but relative to the Morrison government, they're probably doing more to try and free Assange. What's your take on that?
It definitely feels like that, but what is our relationship with the US? We go to war with them. We do all sorts of all manner of things at the behest of the US.
That's right.
To think that we can't even organize a situation where we can have one of our own transferred into our country, even to be in a prison in Australia, as a worst case scenario, anything. But it shows you, there is an imbalance in this relationship, because if it was the other way around, and Australia had wanted some American for something, and they had, hidden in some embassy, 100% they would have been extradited back to the USA. Like, there's no questioning that would have happened if it was a US citizen, and Australia was the person that wanted to prosecute them for something. It wouldn't be happening. They would be back in the US and the country would deal with it. It should be happening in this case for us in Australia, but there is a imbalance in this relationship, I believe.
Yeah, it sounds like Australia, or it seems like Australia is a client state or a satellite state of the United States.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about Antifa. So I know that you've been doing a lot of on-the-street reporting, both in Australia, in London, and other parts of the world. And your style of reporting, I mean, it reminds me of Andy No's style in Portland. And both of you, the way you're attacked, it's very similar as well. And that's ironic because the left always prides itself on its tolerance, and its default position is to term anyone that they deem to be an enemy or hostile as a racist or a misogynist or a bigot. But I think it's interesting, first of all, their relationship with people from minority groups, whether it's women, whether it's people from other ethnic groups or other religious groups, whether it's Sri Lankans, Asians, Jews. If they take a different approach that counters the left-wing worldview, they become very hostile. Do you think there is a racial element to that hostility?
Yeah, I mean, I tend not to believe it's completely racial. I don't think it's racial. I think they're very hard set in their ideological hatred of people. And they believe the only racial part of it is, the comments that I receive is, you're a brown person, you should be identifying with this issue. So I don't know if that's the type of racism. I could fall into that. There's this belief that somehow I'm a victim as well, so therefore I should have this particular belief, and naturally, I think they call me a race traitor. For instance, if I cover something, as an Australian, if I talk about immigration, for instance, and I say mass immigration is bad, they will say, well, you're a race traitor because, you should be for immigration as a default stance, like we are in this instance. So there is that. Again, whether that can be termed as racism, I think people would interpret it as racism if it was on the left. Someone right-wing saying that to a left-wing person, they would interpret that as racism. But I don't necessarily see it that way. I see them as trying to. I think what they're afraid of the most in countries in the West are voices like mine, and I'm not saying that as to blow my head like, oh, I'm important or something. What I'm trying to say is they're afraid of people like myself who are, in the diverse communities that the left love to talk about, having a counter opinion which doesn't align with what they tell you. Right. So it's very troubling for them when a brown-skinned Sri Lankan person comes out and says, oh, Australia is a wonderful country. That's very problematic for them because their whole existence is around saying that, oh, it's so bad for immigrants in Australia. They're treating these people so badly. But then when you have someone that looks like me saying, actually, no, it's there's issues definitely in Australia, but overall, compared to other places, it's an amazing country, and we need to protect these type of values because that's what makes Australia great. That really frustrates them, I believe, and that can be even for people like I think Andy No is not Andy No, sorry, can be for anyone who they could be, for instance, a gay person or a lesbian, but if they come out and say that men are men and women are women, and it's this is we need to have lesbians who are only female. They're also hated on today by these Antifa type lefties. So if you don't conform to their given ideological viewpoint at that exact time, you are their enemy, and they hate you even more if you are meant to be one of these victim classes that you're a part of. And this probably goes back along throughout history. You see that this is a lot in the US with people being called Uncle Toms. This kind of stuff if they share a view that's more in line with Republican or conservative values and they happen to be darker African American, this is just how they do this is how they explain the fact that someone might have a different opinion to them, which should be by default a victim according to them. If that, I hope that made sense. What I'm trying to
Absolutely. I think
say.
from my biased perspective, and I am obviously biased, we all are, and I'm clearly not a psychologist, but I think there is an element of projectionism involved, seeing that they're always out to call people racist, and that's their default argument. I think people, when they do that, they tend to project a lot of the times, especially people, when they point their finger and they say that this is a good example where they say that white people are privileged, yet a lot of these people themselves come from very privileged backgrounds.
Yeah,
Let me
100%. Yeah, I was going to say, like, one of the things that I notice in the West is they look at people who migrated to this country, particularly darker colored people, darker skinned people, brown skinned people, and they don't understand that even in their countries, there's different types of politics. There is left wing people, there's right wing people, there's conservatives, there's people arguing about the same things. It's not something that's unique to the West. So they don't understand that just because you're one of these migrant people and you're now in Australia, that you wouldn't somehow have different political ideas and beliefs that don't align with theirs. Like most of South Asia is by birth conservative because they're a part of family first. It's very much centered around religion. It's very much centered around history. It's very much centered around protecting those things, conserving these things. So traditionally, most people from South Asia, I can speak from that part of the world, are more inclined to be conservative in their political views on certain issues. But these guys don't understand that. They think when you come here, it's like you're like a blank slate, and all of a sudden you're captured by them. You're a part of them, and that goes back to what we started with my family. Like my parents had that belief that they owe something to this group, and I think these left wing groups like Antifa and all these other groups, they take advantage of people, their goodness and their loyalty, and the fact that they're grateful for being here. They take advantage of all those things to try to get them as a voter, or try to get them on board with their cause, or try to get them on side so they can cause some type of other social destruction that they want to do, which benefits them.
That's an interesting point that you raise. Yeah, the left, whether it's the government or non-government organizations or activists, they try to invite immigrants in, mostly from developing nations. America's a good example with Mexico. And these are people, as you've noted, that come from very conservative backgrounds. So in the case of Mexicans, they're very conservative Catholics. So maybe in the first couple of years, they might vote for the Democrats, but eventually, inevitably, they're going to vote Republican because the views, all this woke garbage is clearly misaligned with their own values.
Yeah, that's happening. You see with a lot of this transgenderism and all these kind of issues that we talk about a lot in the West. A lot of the people that are leading these arguments against it are migrants. They come from the Muslim communities, for instance, which is very much not aligned with that type of worldview. So that's happening out there, and I think that we're going to see more and more of that as people become more integrated into societies when it comes to those basic boundaries around their identities from where they come from.
With Antifa, they were basically described by a lot of commentators as a paramilitary wing of the Democrat Party, which is surprising because the Democrat Party is not a fringe party. It's a mainstream party, one of the two parties in the two-party system in the United States, and it's currently the ruling party of the United States of America. What's your take on that? And do you believe that there's also that element in Australia where, whether it's Antifa or the socialists, I can't really tell them apart. They all seem to be the same people, that they're acting as, I guess, the muscle of perhaps the Labor Party and the Greens.
I don't think it's that far gone in Australia in terms of, it's not like what you saw during the 2020 election and the BLM and those riots, and just how involved these groups were in creating that destruction in America that led to a lot of the social issues that we had during that time, right? I don't think the activists, the left or anti for these groups have that type of sway in Australia, but they definitely like to. they think that they do. They believe that they're the same thing. They don't have the organizational structure. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the people. There's not enough left-wing people in this country who are, we have good welfare systems for them. So they're not, it's not like a Portland type situation where you have lots of people who have almost nothing else to do with their life but protest, engage in activism, and cause this type of disharmony in their community. I think in Australia, a lot of these Antifa types are uni students who are studying arts degrees, who put on a mask, and then have all types of different fringe ideas about who they are and what causes they align with, and they're happy to go out there and do that. But deep down there, a lot of them are cowards. A lot of them are afraid. A lot of them are scared. That's why they don't show their face. That is the biggest sign of cowardry that there is. And I noticed in England, a lot of these socialist groups, they don't cover their faces. Even in America, they cover their faces very little. But in Australia, these groups, they always covered their faces. And you can't tell the difference between them and these NSN guys, these so-called far-right, Nazis, whatever, neo-Nazis, because they're all masked up as well. These groups are almost the same thing, just cowards hiding behind masks, try to create social issues in our community, but I don't think they're as effective as they believe they are. I believe we give a lot of attention, for instance, to these neo-Nazi groups who are small in number, who are out there doing this, whereas Antifa are doing something very similar in much larger numbers, but very little, focus on them from the media. I think both groups are equally, destructive for our community if they get out of hand. But we tend not to show the actions of groups like Antifa, because perhaps, like you said, they're more, politically aligned to some of the government groups. They help out with their causes in the sense of mobilizing these protests and so forth. And they're usually quite friendly in a way towards the government, because I remember, like, during the lockdown protests, these same kind of Antifa types, they were organizing pro-vaccine protests. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to have these people who are, think all cops are bad. They hate the establishment. They hate big pharma. Technically, they hate all these kind of ideas. But all of a sudden, they're organizing protests to protect the interests of Pfizer at the end of the day.
Unbelievable. The
You know what I
big
mean?
corporations.
It's complete nonsense. And they were organizing that alongside the Greens. So the Greens, I would say, yes, they heavily depend on some of these activists. Things that you see, they depend on the activism. Labor and Liberal, I don't think, not so much. I don't think we're so politically it's just so ingrained in this country, like that you vote Labor or Liberal. It's the fringe political parties like the Greens, who are not really fringe anymore. They're the ones
unfortunately.
who are yeah, unfortunately. But that may be perhaps because of a lot of the activism and social justice causes that they partake in, and the connections that they have to the universities as well.
What an irony. You just pointed out that they claim to be anti-establishment for many decades on that platform, anti-corporation, anti-police, anti-police brutality, and all of a sudden they did a complete 180 and they were all supporting all of these things. What an irony.
Well, they were cheering on the police brutality towards protesters during lockdown. I mean, they'd say they hate the police, but they were cheering it on and saying, like, oh, well, they have to do that to protect the community. So I mean,
and they had some kind of slogan. I remember they had posters up. I can't remember the slogan. I'll be paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, if you're not vaccinated, you're a fascist. Something ridiculous.
It was like those were the things they were chanting as well. It was very bizarre, that protest, whatever they were doing. These uni students, jumping up and down, promoting vaccines against lockdown protests. It was just really weird.
I'm curious to know, when we were speaking about the woke left, the far left, what on earth's going on with the Liberal Party in Victoria? What's your perspective on that? I'm just scratching my head, looking at this, observing this John Pesutto, Moira Dimming saga from afar.
Look, I live in Melbourne, in the city, and Melbourne is pretty much like Greens territory. I think what's going on with the Liberal Party is they're really afraid to stand on their own principles and values. They believe they have to be more like Labour. They believe they have to be, I guess, very kind of sensible and moderate in many of their policies, more aligned to Labour and more aligned to the Greens to actually get a chance in Victoria. And that could be based on some research they're doing. Who knows? Like, who knows why they're going this way? But it does feel like they're not really, a party that's got liberal values or, even just some basic conservative values, for instance, that you see in some other states, for instance. So it might be because of Victoria itself. They don't feel like that they could win if they were more who they should be as their charter or whatever states. They're swaying away from that and going more towards what they see as being popular in this state, which seems to be Labour and the Greens.
It reminds me of this saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've never really, challenged these issues by being open about their own values and views. Not that I've noticed. You saw what they did to Maura Deeming after that protest. That was the excellent opportunity at that time, even afterwards, months afterwards, to actually, say that we did the wrong thing and to say that we stand by our member for attending a women's rights rally. But they couldn't even bring themselves to do that, based purely on perception, not even based on reality. It's all based on the perception of what people would think. So yeah, it's just a nonsense party. Like, I can't see myself, for instance, voting for the Liberals. you know what I mean? Like, I think most people in this state can't really see themselves voting for the Liberals, even if they hate the Labor Party. They might maybe vote for these other minor parties, but that doesn't always work out, right? So it's really sad to see them. It's sad to see the alternative possibly crumbling away, and Labor really doesn't have competition. But yeah,
it's very sad.
Yeah,
and
I mean, the destruction of Victoria by the Labor Party, that could work in the favor of the Liberals, but is that really what we need to have in our state for the other side to win? Like, the complete destruction of a state through this kind of debt. That's the only time we decide to change government, right? Not based on any other policies or ideas or the way that we want to be as a society. It's purely because they just destroyed the financial capability of this state, so that we're going to give the other guys a chance. I mean, this is not traditionally, I don't think, it's not aspirational politics. There's nothing that defines us as a community in Victoria. There's nothing that defines us as a society. It's purely based on, these guys managed to destroy the economy. We're going to try to rebuild it with these guys. I mean, that's kind of what I see. That's the only way I see the Liberal Party winning, for instance.
Personally, with John Pesutto in charge, and now that Maura Deeming is going to be pursuing High Court action against him, in my opinion, there's no way that the Liberals are going to win the next election with him in charge. And they just keep repeating the same mistakes. They keep using the same platform despite losing multiple times with Matthew Guy, and there was a previous guy in between before him, and they just keep failing. So they clearly don't learn from their mistakes, and they seem to lack introspection and self-awareness.
I agree. I agree with you. I don't see John Pesutto doing anything. Yeah, I don't know what he is, to be honest.
I mean, he's trying to push the woke agenda. He's all for it, and he's showing up to all of these rallies, LGBTQ rallies, and clearly, I mean, these are people that are mostly not going to vote for him, or be unlikely to vote for him anyway. Yet he's sidelining people that would likely be loyal to the Liberal platform, but now can't be due to what he's promoting, what he's standing for, and what he's done to Moira.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think these guys are betting on the destruction of Victoria. I'm not talking about destruction in an evil sense. I'm saying the financial kind of crippling of Victoria to allow them to win. So people that are maybe Labor voters might be like, oh, we'll give these guys a try. Not for any other reason but that. I think that's what they're hedging their bets on. So they're trying to like fit in as, Labor light.
And Rukshan, now I just want to ask you one final thing. I'll talk to you the whole night, but I want to ask you, just as a wrap up, You mentioned at the start of the podcast that you were called a Zionist. And I've seen your reporting, and look, we've been conditioned as a society to think just because someone has a different point of view, we have to paint them as the other and dehumanize them, which is not the Australia that I grew up in. And I think, from my perspective, I think you've been quite objective. You've been going to rallies and you gave people at those rallies, not far leftists, but people from Muslim backgrounds, from ethnic backgrounds. I remember you interviewed a Catholic Lebanese lady, and she was wearing a keffiyeh, and you, portrayed her quite fairly. But what's with this? How did you earn this Zionist label?
I think there's lots of different reasons why I've earned the label. Maybe my friendships as well, potentially, which is a strange concept for me living in Australia, because I have friends with lots of different people from
associating with Avi.
Yeah, well, Avi, yeah, that's the is that the elephant in the room, as it were. But look, again, I'm in Australia. I'm friends with all types of different people, and you can't just make these kind of crazy claims. But of course, people will make these claims. It's been a very difficult subject. I've learned a lot actually over the past couple of months covering this issue in Australia. I'm by no means an expert on foreign policy and all this kind of stuff and what's happening in the Middle East, besides very generic kind of knowledge. And I know a lot of people right now, they think they're full on experts on this because they've seen some TikTok videos and they've consumed a few articles and all this kind of stuff. And everyone comes into this with their own set of beliefs and values as well. And for me, I've approached this entire saga from the fact that I'm living in Australia, that I'm an Australian. And there are basic core values that we as Australians have, and I don't want to sway from that, because I don't believe we need to sway from that to understand some of these issues which are happening in our community. I'm not in Israel or Gaza or Palestine. I'm in Australia, and the issues that are impacting Australians when it comes to this. Yes, of course, there are people who are of Israeli background or Jewish or Palestinian or Arabic or Muslim who are from that region. They're impacted in a different way that I could never really understand. I could never be in their shoes to feel it from that perspective. But I can see the community issues that it's causing here, the tension that it's causing here. The rise in fear of certain groups of people to be out there on the street. I can kind of sense all that when I go to these rallies and talk to people. And it's a very, very real thing that happens. And it's a consequence, of course, of multiculturalism and the kind of country that we live in. There are benefits to multiculturalism, of course, but there are also downsides. And I think we're seeing one of the downsides where we can have disharmony when governments don't intervene to ensure that there's certain boundaries which are set around how we, communicate with different groups and communities, and the limits of that, I think, need to be defined. It's unfortunate, but I think that's just the reality of living in a multicultural society as well. It can't be a free for all where we have people from around the world, from different countries, from different ethnic conflicts, prosecuting their wars on our streets, and bringing things which are not necessarily Australian, and doing things which again cause disharmony in other facets for other people in this country as well. I don't think that's the right thing to do, because as someone who's from a different background, and I come from a country that's had a civil war, I think it would be weird if I went to Palestinians or Israelis and Australians, be like, oh, tell me, do you support the Sinhalese people or do you support the Tamil people? Tell me right now who you support, because based on that is going to determine how I treat you as an Australian. That's ridiculous, because so many people from around the world, there's ethnic conflicts in their countries, and all types of wars and all types of civil conflicts, and we can't treat people like that. So I have friends who are Jewish. I have friends who are Muslim or Arabic. I have clients who are Jewish. I have clients who are Muslim or Arabic. As an Australian, I'm sensitive to all these type of different people's experiences in this country. And I look at it from that perspective. So yes, I take great offense at being labeled certain things, or being forced to have a certain view, being forced to report on things a certain way. Because I do get lots of strange messages from people about, you shouldn't be reporting it like this. you're a Zionist, look at this, and, you know, tell the truth of what's happening. And I'm like, I can tell the truth of what's happening in that country, but I can also tell the truth of what's happening in Australia. And I'm choosing to tell the truth of what's happening and what it's doing to people, you know, in Australia. And it's a choice that I've made because I think for many of us, unless you go there, unless you're from the region, you can't really, you know, you're just pretending if you think you understand these issues. Because if some random dude, you know, from Israel or from Palestine came and told me about some issues that are happening in Sri Lanka, unless they're like a historian or they've spent time there doing stuff, they wouldn't really understand what that means for that particular group of people. So I'm realistic about where I approach these things from. Again, when it comes to criticizing the government, when it comes to criticizing the Australian government's role, when it comes to criticizing the Israeli government or the US government's role, yes, as a commentator, I can do those things. When it comes to criticizing terrorists, of course, as a commentator, I'm more than comfortable criticizing acts of terrorism. And that's one of the things I've really tried to tell people that, you know, as a basic Australian value, we don't support acts of terrorism. If you as an Australian cannot condemn, if you as an Australian cannot condemn acts of terrorism, then you as an Australian are also going to have a difficult time holding to account the actions of IDF, for instance, if they're war crimes or not. You know, if you as an individual in this country in the West cannot say terrorists are bad, you cannot then turn around and say, oh, the military is bad. You know what I mean? Like, you need to have that balance. I don't expect that from, for instance, Israelis. I don't expect that from Palestinians as a observer in this country, because again, it's a very sensitive issue that's related to people from that region, and there's a history that goes back a long way, and people are going to have different views on this. But as an Australian, of course, I expect our journalists in this country to understand that terrorism is not something that we, you know, glorify as being justified because of some historical reason. Because if that was the case, if that was actually true, there is all types of grievances where people in this country can just go around treating people like crap because of history. There's all types of reasons that people can go around killing people and doing all manner of things because of history. You know, history is one thing. History is not what defines us in this country, in Australia, when it doesn't relate to Australia and our existence with other people. So I hope I've made sense in
Absolutely. And we saw something
how
similar. 100%, definitely. And we saw something similar with the Ukraine-Russia conflict as
yeah.
well, where you either have to be for or against, and if you took a particular stance, you would be dehumanized and deemed as the
I
other.
mean, exactly. And like it's like this, right? I don't want to turn around and be like, oh, I don't care about this conflict. Of course I care about this conflict. I care about this conflict because I have friends who are impacted by this conflict in one way or another, right? I care about it from that level. But at the end of the day, you ask, you know, people who don't live in multicultural societies, right? We benefit from living amongst other people where we can empathize and care about their struggles of their people for whatever reason. And they can tell us those stories, and we can listen to those stories, and we can, you know, help them, or we can fundraise for them. We can do all manner of things. But there are parts of the world where you don't have that, where it's just one ethnicity or one group, and they don't have this multitude of views to deal with. They don't have those issues, so they'll just be for one side. All right, they'll just be like, oh, we just support this side because, you know, this is the same religion as us, right? You see this in the world right now. This is happening. But in Australia, in the West, we've invited everyone from around the world, so we have to learn to live together here as well.
That's right.
And it's very important that people don't forget that the country that they live in right now is in Australia. I don't live in Israel. I don't live in Palestine. Yes, I care about what is happening there, but I don't want that crap here. And I don't want to say it in that manner, but I'm just being very honest and frank. I don't want that crap here because it's the same crap that my family got away from Sri Lanka. So I'm not bringing that crap from Sri Lanka here and forcing it down your throat, in the sense of accepting certain things which are happening in that country, in that history. All right. So we don't want that from any other place in that world. And I don't know if that's a wrong view to have. I don't know if this Australia first view is wrong, but I think it's conducive to a healthy society, where we try to, differentiate between issues which are happening outside of us and issues which are happening in the country related to that. There's no way that we can escape the fact that Australia is involved in a way through the West. And, we're seeing today, Australia, I think they voted with New Zealand and Canada for a ceasefire, for instance. So, our country does take actions, and people protesting, all of that stuff is completely fine. It's more so around trying to force people to share a certain view because you believe that that is the right view because of your own experience as someone from that part of the world. I think that's wrong, and I don't think that actually makes sense in a multicultural society. At least in a healthy multicultural society, it actually demonstrates the issues with multiculturalism. Like I think that there are some issues that we're seeing right now that, if not clearly defined and kept a check on, it can lead to situations where it's uncomfortable for people. Right now, I think it's the Israeli community, it's the Muslim community, it's the Palestinian community who are the Jewish community who are dealing with these impacts, but it can turn and be some other community down the track, right? We can't have these woke agendas of people being told that we got to boycott this, boycott that business here because the owner's Jewish or the owner's Indian or the owner's Sri Lankan, whatever. You can't have that nonsense happening here and being allowed by the government, which is the biggest problem.
Absolutely. And coming from, I guess, a similar background, coming from an immigrant background, one of the things that I've observed as an outsider, I mean, now I'm obviously an Australian citizen, I'm assimilated, but one of the things that I've observed was, and that I admire about this country, is the sporting events. So you've got, for example, the football, the AFL, the cricket, you've got two opposing teams playing, but the people there, they're all, and whether the tennis as well, they're all respecting each other. The people from two opposing teams can sit in the same stadium and they can shake hands and they can get along, they can have a beer together, and it's all in good fun. But you contrast that to overseas, in Europe, in England, and in Germany, in South America, where they act like wild animals.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we are so lucky and fortunate in Australia. Like, it is, it's crazy to me that people who left behind things like this would want to import that type of behavior into this country. I find that personally disappointing. And I understand, for instance, the stakes might be high, and yes, everything that is happening is horrendous and horrific. I understand all of that, but there should be a point where people understand that we live in a country like Australia. We are so privileged in that sense that us having this freedom and privilege to be amongst other people, like you said, without having these issues, we should be wanting that for others. We should be imparting that on the rest of the world that doesn't have that, instead of coming here, taking advantage of that and then trying to create that disharmony here. Definitely leaders need to stand up. And I've been impressed, honestly, with the Liberal Party, the Federal Liberal Party, for Peter Dutton for taking some of these hardline stances. And I know it's not popular to say, but you need leaders that actually clarify what it means to be an Australian and what our values should be. And unfortunately, sometimes those values are broken by a particular group. They might not mean to. They might be well-meaning, and they might have all types of reasons for behaving in a particular way. At the end of the day, that social cohesion is more important than that. No singular group from anywhere in the world should be dictating what the base set of Australian values should be, is what I'm trying to say. And this is the current issue today is, Israel, Palestine. We have massive migrant populations, for instance, from India and, other parts of South Asia. There's issues like this in India. There's ethnic conflicts in that region between different groups. We saw some of that in Melbourne. I don't know if you know, there were some issues in Melbourne between, Hindus and Sikhs. But when those things maybe spill out and get out of control, we shouldn't be encouraging that type of rhetoric. We should be toning it down and putting people and reminding them that they're actually in Australia to live an Australian life with Australian values. Yes, celebrate your culture, celebrate everything that's good about where you've come from, but don't bring the bad, don't bring the wars.
That's right.
Don't bring this type of stuff to our street, because that is not conducive to a better, brighter future in Australia that people have come here for.
It's a lose-lose situation if you try to import all the ethnic hatred and war and conflicts to Australia. It's one thing to have another opinion, but to get violent and physical And that's just crossing the line. And unfortunately, that's what we saw in Caulfield. And, I mainly blame the socialists. I mean, you did some really great reporting there. It's fantastic. And but I also, to some degree, I think that as an individual, I think the owner of Burgatory, in my opinion, did a lot to incite the hatred when it was unnecessary, and he pinned the blame on, unfortunately, on the community. But I think the people that fanned the flames, that were primarily responsible for the incitement and for exacerbating the situation, were the socialists. And from your reporting, you show that they had marshals
Yeah,
there that were controlling the whole thing.
I mean, I don't blame the Palestinian community, for instance, for whatever happened there. Maybe some of the leaders, maybe like whatever,
Individuals.
that decided to go along with these socialists that turned up there as well. But these socialists, they have no idea. They have no idea about these things. They have no idea about a lot of these kids that maybe have never seen conflict or never understood a civil conflict and what it's all about, and and the issues that it can cause, the further issues it can cause. For them, it's like, Israel Palestine is it's like a little fight, and it's like a left and right, and Dutton supports Israel, so the right is against Palestine, so it's all these kind of ideas in their head, right? But at the end of the day, the people who are suffering are Israelis and Palestinians in various degrees. In Australia, in some way, but also obviously in the region itself. So these guys, they have no idea, but they're happy to engage in this type of destructive protests because it serves no purpose. Like, what was the point of that? Of that particular protest? They'll make all types of excuses and reasons for it, and perhaps you could justify it if you wanted to, like academically. But when you look at the issues that kind of thing causes, it's un-Australian. When people criticize those protests, when I'm not criticizing the right of people to protest, I'm sure go wherever you want and protest, but there are consequences to the protests that you make.
Well, it's quite another thing too. I mean, again, from my own biased perspective, to go to the heartland of the Jewish community on the eve of their Sabbath and stand outside a synagogue that got evacuated, and
but
I think that's probably
what these socialists say is, well, the Jews don't own Caulfield, and look, they're right, and all of this stuff makes sense, and it's Australia, it's a free country, you can do what you like. All of that is right, but the reality is, of course, it's like you going in front of a mosque, right? The mosque is not owned by it's an Australian mosque. It's in Australia. It's part of the Australian community, but there are consequences to going in front of a mosque and doing something like this. And that is, again, we're talking about these adults and these kids and these these Antifa types that have no responsibility about any of the other consequences. They don't care. They want this chaos. That's what they're trying to create. So they're happy to be there. And that's what I was trying to highlight in that coverage, that these people know what's happening here right now, but they're happy to engage in this type of destructive behavior in our community.
They clearly know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing. Like I as someone who covers these things, the first thing I thought of when these people were going there, when I was going there to cover it, was like, this is not a good thing. Like, there's going to be two groups here, and there's going to be some sort of clash. And there was. I mean, the police were there, but eventually someone broke through the police line and there was a clash because both sides, they're worked up about it. One side is getting very aggro, and these things happen. And it was just very obvious that it was going to happen, which is why I started live streaming, because it was like, it's getting unsafe for me here as well now. It's very predictable what the next thing is going to happen is. So, of course, the left-wing activists who are a part of this, they would be very much aware of what is happening. They're trying to act innocent. We're just being marshals. We're kind of keep things safe. But they're watching these two community groups, the Palestinians and the Jewish community, going at each other. And they're like trying to be these marshals. Like, what the hell are these people doing? That's what I'm thinking in my head.
And you captured a key moment when the marshals started to retreat. The leader of the so-called marshals, whoever they were, the far leftists, was saying, okay, guys, it's time to go home. And I think he knew that at that moment, violence was going to break out. So they were just there, they were fanning the flames, and then they left right at the point when they knew that there was going to be a violent confrontation.
100%. Like, if you want to talk about, people like to say controlled opposition, this controlled this and that. This is like some sort of controlled, like chaos type thing where it's deliberate. And a lot of these actions that they're doing, like going to, I think the hotel where the family was staying, for instance, is that
Family
necessary?
of hostages.
Yes, is okay. Sure, protest, have views, whatever, but is that necessary? Again, when I say that because we live in Australia, every Sunday you have tens of thousands of people protesting for this cause, getting their message out, perhaps being effective, depending on who you ask. They have school students coming out protesting. It's not like protest is not being allowed. Protest is allowed, but they're choosing specifically to take actions which cause disharmony in the wider community, which I think is problematic. And again, there's a balance between the right to protest and doing that type of thing. And that's when I spoke about the climate protesters. The police took action against the climate protesters, but not necessarily action against these people who were inside essentially private property, the hotel lobby.
That's interesting.
Doing this type of thing, right?
They didn't give them move on orders.
Yeah, the protesters.
And that's not a public, like you said, it's not a public space.
It's not a public place. The climate protesters, they do the utmost best, the police they can, to keep them on the pavement area, keep them surrounded, push them along. They do all that stuff, right? But on private property, where they probably have more ability to actually take action, no such action was taken. So, we're going in circles now, but it goes back to what we were discussing before about the inability of police to like deal with some of these issues. And I think these protesters that are doing these type of deliberate actions to cause disharmony are aware of this. And they're trying to push the limits of that as well. And the more that they can get away with it, the more that they will do. And all it's doing is creating disharmony in the wider Australian community.
Absolutely.
And the impacts of this are not just today. The impacts of this go on for years to come. And it's gonna, we're seeing it happening in the schooling system. It's all types of impacts that we can't even imagine that this is going to cause. And that's what I'm concerned about. So if we go back to the question you asked me about my coverage, that's my concern when it comes to this, because that is something that I can, see firsthand when I go to these protests. And it's something that I can understand by listening to what people are saying on the streets here. And it's something that I can comment on as an Australian when it comes to this, because I feel like I still have a right as an Australian, as do all Australians, to be able to comment on, the expectations that we have in this country for the way that we want to live with each other. I think it's a fair thing to be able to comment on that and call things out as I see it. It's uncomfortable, definitely. It's uncomfortable. It's much more easy to be, say the popular things and go along with what's maybe being more not going to cause issues with people when you say certain things. But I've had to really challenge myself to, be even more upfront with some of my views around this, because it's impacting my country, it's impacting my community, and I'm prepared to put myself out there and say exactly what I think when it comes to those issues.
I hope we come to a day back to the Australia that we both knew growing up, where just like on the sporting field, you can have your sports team. You can also have a political view that's vastly different, but you can still be mates with the other person and not dehumanize them and name call them. That's the Australian way. That's the Australia I knew.
100%. Like, I do not care what other people's political views are. You'd be surprised. I really don't care. Even if you're like, far left and even if you're like one of these Antifa types, I really don't. I don't care. Like, everyone for themselves, whatever. Do whatever you want. The only time I really care is when they start indoctrinating people or forcing certain things down people, or telling people that they can't have a certain view because of, they're not allowed to, or they're a victim, whatever. Like, those things get to me. But besides that, like, I'm happy to be friends with anyone. And I do have a lot of friends from all types of different backgrounds, because that is one of the things, especially with my career and the community and the areas that I've grown up in. Everyone is very diverse in terms of political views and, what their views are from where they come from. Like, that's one of the biggest things for me growing up in Dandenong in the southeast suburbs, is you're with like all types of people from everywhere, all sorts of backgrounds.
United
And
Nations.
you say it is a United Nation. I think it's the most multicultural, like melting pot in Australia is that region in Dandenong, right? So having that, I've learned so much about the world, in terms of how people from different backgrounds usually don't. They have grievances with each other, but they still get along. As your kids, you're pretty innocent with this stuff. You can have different political views and get along. Like no one really cares. Like that's like it's what you said. It used to be like that. I think it still is like that, but we're being told that we need to care about what other people's politics are. I don't think it really matters as much as they're trying to make it an issue.
Exactly. And I think it's ironic. Daniel Andrews always says, he makes a comment, we're trying to import American politics into Australia. And coming from him, that's quite ironic considering his platform. He has imported the very worst aspects of American culture into Australia.
So I think I agree. I was going to say, like what you said, he's just seen the natural pushback to that, which he thinks is like the opposite of, it's in importing American politics. It's just a natural opposition to whatever he's been importing himself.
And Rukshan, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our audience?
I don't have any final thoughts or words of wisdom, but I have seen, the freedom movement, as it's termed. And before you said I'm an integral part of the freedom movement. That's not by choice. Maybe adopted into it. And I'm not saying this in a bad way or a disparaging way, but I'm saying I did the independent journalism work, and a lot of people in that community, shared that work or found value in that work. But what I'm noticing a lot is, there's certain I don't know if it's biases or certain way that the community behaves as well when it comes to other topics. And you see that a lot. And I think, in the long run, what we need to understand is that, these community, we come together on certain issues. Definitely, there's things that bring us together, but on other issues, it's only normal that people have different views, and it's only normal that people are gonna, have a different opinion and prosecute that opinion and debate those opinions. And I think what we're forgetting is that it's actually healthy to have debate. It's actually healthy to have different views, and that's what we didn't have during the pandemic or COVID. We had got a government-fed narrative where people weren't allowed to express and debate different views. Doctors weren't allowed to give different views. Today, we don't have that. We have individuals who have different views who are arguing amongst themselves. And that is not necessarily an unhealthy thing. Even if you don't agree with them, it's usually a good thing that people are having these type of debates and these views. So, what I'm trying to say is that, still respect people. I've seen a lot of people disrespect each other and say, oh, this person is, he's like he's like this now because of this particular thing. I think it's a ridiculous way to live. to be like that. You're never gonna 100% agree with every single person. It is not possible. You're always gonna have slight variations and disagreements.
I think the world would be a very dull place. We all agreed with each other.
Exactly. It would be very much like that. So I think it's much more beneficial for us if you want to actually, take on, a lot of people want to take on the government in the sense of challenging them and challenging their narratives. You want to take on the mainstream media. You want to take on all this stuff. Well, when it comes to all of that, it's actually diversity is a strength when you're challenging these people, because they would love nothing more than everyone to be divided, and hating each other when it's appropriate. Whereas if you can have different views and different opinions, talk amongst each other, be respectful, but also agree on certain things which are important. For instance, the values of this country, the direction of this country, like certain core things that we all agree on. Overall, that's more beneficial than just finding an echo chamber. Is just what I'm noticing from the discourse that I'm seeing online, because it is splintering now. It's all kind of falling apart. Everyone's kind of everywhere, and that's the best place for people to be in for the government because it's open fodder for them, right? They can push through all sorts of stuff, all
Divide
manner
and conquer.
divide and
The
conquer.
misinformation bill. They can push through that without anyone noticing.
That's right. People lose their focus. So it's only natural for people to have varying views and different views, and there's all manner of reasons for that. I think it should be welcomed in some aspects. Of course, people should be challenged on their views, but doesn't necessarily mean that you're more awake or whatever it is because you have a certain view that a couple of your friends agree with. The world doesn't necessarily work that way, and you're only asking for more trouble and more pain if that's the worldview that you have. I think you really have to be open to all manner of views and opinions.
Absolutely. And I think Cafe Lockdown, we do have a diverse audience. I mean, we all can agree on one thing. One common denominator is we believe in small government and limited government interference or no government interference. But I think it's fair to say, I think I speak for everyone, the whole audience, you could only have true diversity when the government's not there dictating and being the arbiter of truth and what's true and what's not true. I think that's when you can have a true diversity and differences of opinion in a society. Anything
100%.
other than that is a totalitarian police state.
That's right, and that's why this disinformation bill should be scrapped, defeated. Even if it gets passed, it should be vigorously campaigned against. Even the government should change based on if they will get rid of it or not, if it ever gets through, because that's the kind of nonsense that actually is very detrimental to our societies.
We're heading down a very dangerous path. But I do see hope. I do have faith in Australia and Australians and the Australian way of life. And I think there's a silver lining to everything that's happening. So Rukshan, it's been an honor. Great to have you on the podcast, and would love to have you back on again.
Yeah, anytime, man. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much.